And as the audience here in the chapel of the old Royal Naval College at Greenwich slips away for interval refreshments, mince pies and mulled wine were on offer in the crypt here before the concert. Radio 3 is going to refresh its memories of another of Gerald Finzi's choral works. In Pax Terra, the cantata that begins the second half of tonight's concert. Here's Stephen Johnston with Discovering Music to explore some of the musical, poetic and personal experiences that lie behind Finzi's final major work.
When Gerald Finzi was in his early 20s, he had an experience which stayed with him for the whole of his life. He was invited to join a group of bell ringers in the tiny church on Chosen, or Churchdown Hill in Gloucester, to ring in the new year. For such a small eminence, Chosen Hill is rich in musical associations. It was the favourite haunt, for instance, of Gloucester composers Herbert Howells and Ivor Gurney, and they portrayed it in music. An especially beautiful representation of Chosen Hill is found in the slow movement of Howells's remarkable youthful piano quartet. You do get a sense of space in that music, and perhaps also of being high up, the purity of the air, the wide vistas. It's rather a shame that Chosen Hill today is framed, or rather boxed in, by the M5 and the very busy A417. The atmosphere certainly won't be like it was when Gerald Finzi rang out those bells on a winter's eve. You could imagine them then sounding for miles around. Years later, when Finzi was in his 50s, he recaptured the sense of those bells sounding out their ecstatic message across the broad Severn Valley in a choral work entitled In Terra Pax, On Earth, Peace. It's rather typical of Finzi, who was a uniquely gifted songwriter, that he should have given the bells voices in that music. The words of the angel chorus in the Christmas message, as told in the Gospel of St. Luke, are affixed, as it were, to the sound of the bell chimes. And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men." The bells of Chosen Hill become the Christmas angels in Terra Pax. They sing out in ecstatic overlapping imitation to a familiar bell chime. That's an almost archetypal bell motif, from the English church towers that Finzi knew well to the Chapel of the Grail in Wagner's Parsifal. And at a very different pitch, it's the motif that launches in Terra Pax. When that motif sounds deep down on strings and harp, it really does sound like the bell effects in Parsifal, as Finzi must have been well aware. And the there's something else that makes me suspect that might be a deliberate reference. The marking of this music is adagietto, an unusual marking in music, though famously associated with one piece or movement which also uses strings and harps. The adagietto fourth movement from Mahler's Symphony No. 5, as Gerald Finzi certainly did know, because he conducted a performance of the adagietto with his Newbury string players not long before the composition of In Terra Pax in 1954. So, it would seem we have subtle allusions to music by a Jewish composer, Mahler, and to music by one of the most notorious of classical music's anti-Semites, Wagner. It could be a coincidence, yet it chimes in, if you'll pardon the pun, with an experience that Finzi described as seminal for In Terra Pax, one of the earliest Newbury string players' Christmas concerts, which, and it's important to stress this, didn't include any of Finzi's own works. This is what he said about that concert. I did rejoice to think that agnostics, Roman Catholics, Anglo-Catholics, Jews, Chapel and Church of England were all gathered together, seeing a beautiful sight, listening to decent music, and with all their ridiculous differences dropped for at least an hour. Finzi himself was of Jewish descent on both sides of the family. He was a lover of the English language, of its music, of its culture, its poetry. Yet at the same time he stood slightly outside as a Jew. So when we have Wagner and Mahler bowing their heads musically side by side in the opening of In Terra Pax, it's a delicious image, the kind of thing you could imagine would have touched Finzi deeply. Intentional or not, it's rather fitting that the next subtle echo should be of English music's great Christian agnostic, a friend and champion of Finzi, Ralph Vaughan Williams. We find him musically interweaving with the Wagner-Mahler chimes motif. There's a strong hint there of a benediction-like figure from the slow movement of Vaughan Williams's Symphony No. 5. If these allusions are deliberate, then Finzi is drawing together not just musical ideas, but cultural and even religious elements. The music of Vaughan Williams's Fifth Symphony was inspired partly by the composer's own personal take on Bunyan's spiritual classic, The Pilgrim's Progress. Significantly, Vaughan Williams changed the name of the leading character from Christian to Pilgrim to underline the universal message. And all that's very much in keeping with Finzi's message in Terra Pax. It's worth noting here the words that are left out of that title in the angelic message. On earth, peace, to men, boni voluntatis, of goodwill. That's slightly different, isn't it, from the King James Bible's goodwill to all men. The Latin has peace to all men of goodwill. And it's as though Finzi's music is drawing together men of goodwill, of different hues, as in that Christmas concert he remembered so vividly. And perhaps Finzi's also generously including even Wagner as a man of goodwill. Soon after that rapt adagietto introduction, we have the first hint of bells on a winter's night on the harp and celeste. So we have a peaceful, meditative introduction, rather like a church organist improvising before a service. Then the tempo settles back into adagietto and the first human voice is heard. Now the focus changes. That international all men now becomes very local. The baritone solo sings words of a poem by Robert Bridges. No doubt this was selected by Finzi partly for its association with that evening on Chosen Hill all those years ago. Yet it's shifted back a few days in the church calendar to the other big midwinter feast. A frosty Christmas Eve, when the stars were shining, fared I forth alone. Here we really note Finzi's special sensitivity to the rhythms of the English language, and especially here to Bridges' verse. He could so easily have set it to Robert Bridges' basic rhythm, a frosty Christmas Eve, when the stars were shining, fared I forth alone. The kind of iambic da-da-da-da pattern you so often find in English poetry. But Finzi sets it as though he were reciting it, an imaginative, sensitive recitation, stretching, contracting, and generally playing with the rhythms to underline the expressive effect.
A frosty Christmas Eve, when the stars were shining, fared I forth alone, where westward falls the hill, and from many a village in the watered valley, distant music reached me. Peals of bells are ringing, the constellated sounds ran sprinkling on earth's floor. As the dark vault above with stars was spangled
Distant music reached me. Peals of bells are ringing. The constellated sounds ran sprinkling on earth's floor, as the dark vault above with stars was spangled o'er. Those words could have been written for Gerald Finzi. How could he read them without recalling the moment when he too, outsider though he was, as a Jew and a sensitive artist, was drawn into the uniquely English and uniquely beautiful form of celebration that we have in bell ringing. There follows a bit of what you might call creative continuity, a beautifully engineered transition from Bridges' words to those of St. Luke's Gospel. In its gentler, quieter way, this juxtaposition is every bit as effective as the Wilfred Owen Latin Requiem transitions in Britain's War Requiem. Bridges and the baritone's thoughts take us back to the first Christmas of all, and the music heard by the shepherds in the fields. Was it the voice of angels or the bright stars singing?
And Madeline could not tell whether it were angels or the bright stars singing.
So the baritone has recalled that first Christmas of all, and the sound of the angels singing. Was it the bright stars? Now comes a beautiful transition as the chorus enter with the words of St. Luke's Gospel, as though they were simply continuing the narrative. The angel messenger arrives. There's a big build-up on the chorus. And again, Finzi's sensitivity to rhythm in word setting really tells here. The rhythms in the build-up are very plastic, but then at the climactic and the glory of the Lord shone about them, the rhythms become quite regular and hymn-like. Not too regular, though. You can still hear the great poetry reader in this. Now we hear the words of the angel, sung by a soprano solo. Rather strikingly, the first two words, "Fear not," are heard 3 times. You can imagine it's as though the shepherds need telling more than once, like someone soothing a child. Yet at the same time it's authoritative. The soprano's "Fear not" picks up on the interval of a descending fifth, which, if we just go back a bar or two, you can hear is touched on by the orchestra just a couple of seconds earlier. The regular reassuring rhythms of "Fear not" are contrasted with the more plastic, speech-like rhythms of the rest of the angel's speech. Next comes a tender, intimate description of the babe lying in the manger, from which we move on to the final climactic vision, the passage we heard at the opening. Bridges asked in his poetry whether it was the angels or the stars themselves singing. Now Finzi, through his music, adds another little dimension to that question. Could it not also have been the sound of those church bells on Chosen Hill? The climax subsides gradually, and then, as the chorus ceases, another quiet improvisation like meditation follows from the orchestra. once again starting with the chimes motive and its message of goodwill to all men. In another gorgeous poetic segue, the baritone enters with Robert Bridges' words again and takes us back to Finzi's memory of New Year's Eve on Chosen Hill. But to me heard afar it was starry music, angels' song, comforting as the comfort of Christ when he spake tenderly to his sorrowful flock.
When he spake tenderly to his sorrowful flock.
Finzi himself was in need of such comfort in 1954. Just 3 years earlier, he'd discovered that he was suffering from Hodgkin's disease, a form of cancer of the lymphatic system. Today, he might have stood a good chance of survival, but then, well, in fact, he had only 2 years to live. Yet, given all that, there's a remarkable serenity prevailing in Terra Pax. Like his friend Vaughan Williams, Finzi was able to draw comfort from the Christian message, despite his agnosticism. He sensed that there was something in these words, even if it wasn't the dogmatic interpretations that those RCs, Anglo-Seas, Chapel and C of E placed on them. It was something that he himself had sensed on that frosty eve, years earlier, beyond the cries of bells, when, in Robert Bridges' words, I stood on the hill, hearkening in the aspect of the eternal silence.